The rain poured heavily that evening, washing over the busy city streets as cars honked and pedestrians rushed to find cover. In the distance, the sound of sirens echoed through the night, blending with the hum of the city's chaos. A sleek black sports car cruised down the road, its polished surface gleaming under the streetlights. Inside sat a man dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his wrist adorned with an elegant watch that probably cost more than most people's yearly salary. He sat calmly, one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting on the leather armrest. He had an air of confidence about him, the kind that came from years of hard work and success. But to those who didn't know him, he might have looked out of place in a car that luxurious. A few blocks away, a police cruiser was parked at the side of the road. Inside sat Officer Grant, a middle-aged cop with a stern expression and a growing chip on his shoulder. He'd had a rough day dealing with petty crimes, disrespectful citizens, and a lingering frustration that had been building up for months. Tonight, he was looking for an outlet, a way to assert the authority he believed people no longer respected. As the black sports car came into view, his eyes narrowed. Something about it just didn't sit right with him. He didn't recognize the driver, and in his mind, anyone driving a car that expensive in this neighborhood had to be up to no good. He flipped on his lights and pulled onto the road, his cruiser speeding up to catch the sleek vehicle. The man in the sports car glanced in his rearview mirror, his brow furrowing as he noticed the flashing lights. With a sigh, he signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. He wasn't worried he'd done nothing wrong. His license and registration were in order, and he hadn't been speeding. Still, he knew all too well how these encounters could sometimes go. Officer Grant stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his belt as he walked toward the car. His footsteps were deliberate, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat as he reached the driver's side window, tapping it with unnecessary force. The man rolled it down, keeping his expression neutral. "Evening, officer," he said calmly. "License and registration," Grant barked, ignoring the polite greeting. The man reached for his documents, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid any misunderstanding. He handed them over, watching as the officer examined them with a scowl. Grant didn't recognize the name on the license, but the address listed was from one of the wealthiest parts of town. He glanced at the man, suspicion clouding his judgment. "What are you doing in this area?" Grant asked, his tone sharp and accusatory. The man raised an eyebrow. "Driving home." "Is there a problem?" "Don't get smart with me," Grant snapped. "This car doesn't belong here." "You got drugs in the vehicle?" "Weapons?" The man's calm demeanor faltered slightly, his patience thinning. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. If you could tell me why you pulled me over, I'd appreciate it." Grant's jaw tightened. To him, the man's calmness came off as arrogance, and it only fueled his need to assert control over the situation. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. The man hesitated, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "Why?" "I said step out of the vehicle," Grant barked, his voice rising. With a resigned sigh, the man complied, opening the door and stepping into the rain. He stood tall, his suit now damp but his composure still intact. Grant looked him over, his eyes lingering on the man's watch and shoes, both of which screamed wealth. It only made him more determined to find something, anything, to justify his actions. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," Grant demanded. "Is this really necessary?" the man asked, his voice steady but firm. Grant took a step closer, his hand inching toward his gun. "Do it now." The man clenched his jaw but complied, placing his hands on the sleek surface of his car. Grant began patting him down, his movements rough and impatient. Finding nothing, he moved to the vehicle, opening the doors and rummaging through the interior without permission. The man turned slightly, his frustration evident. "Officer, I don't consent to this search," he said firmly. Grant ignored him, pulling open the glove compartment and rifling through it. His actions were reckless, fueled by an assumption he refused to let go of. The man stood in the rain, his fists clenched at his sides as he watched his property being violated. A small crowd began to gather on the sidewalk, people pulling out their phones to record the scene. Whispers spread among them, some recognizing the man and others simply appalled by the officer's behavior. "Isn't that?" one woman murmured, her voice trailing off as she raised her phone to capture the unfolding drama. Grant noticed the onlookers but didn't care. In his mind, he was in the right. He was the law, and this man needed to be put in his place. "You don't look like someone who can afford a car like this," Grant said, his tone dripping with disdain. The man straightened, his eyes meeting the officer's with a steely resolve. "And what does someone like me look like, officer?" Grant's expression faltered for a moment, the question catching him off guard. But before he could respond, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the scene. The crowd murmured in surprise as the vehicle's doors opened and two well-dressed individuals stepped out, their presence commanding attention. One of them approached the man, shielding him from the rain with an umbrella. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked, concern etched on his face. The man nodded, though his jaw was still tight. "I'm fine." Grant's confidence wavered as the second individual approached him, pulling out a badge that gleamed under the streetlights. "Officer, step away from the vehicle," the man ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Grant's face paled as he realized who he was dealing with. These weren't just any random people, they were security personnel for someone far more important than he'd anticipated. The man in the suit turned to face Grant, his calm demeanor replaced with an unmistakable air of authority. "Officer, do you have any idea who I am?" he asked, his voice low but powerful. Grant stammered, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of the situation. I was just doing my job." The man stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Grant's. "You pulled me over for no reason. You searched my car without cause. And now, you've humiliated yourself in front of all these people." Grant's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The crowd's whispers grew louder, their phones capturing every moment of his unraveling. The man took a deep breath, his composure returning. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," he said, turning back to his car. But before he could leave, one of the security personnel approached him, leaning in to whisper something in his ear. The man's expression hardened as he listened, his gaze shifting back to Grant. "Actually," he said, his voice cold, "you're not getting off that easy." Grant's heart sank as the reality of his actions began to set in. He was no longer in control of the situation. And whatever was about to happen next, he knew it wouldn't end well for him. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded, their phones still recording. The man got back into his car, his security detail following close behind. As the black sports car disappeared into the night, Officer Grant stood frozen in place, the weight of his mistakes crashing down on him. But this was only the beginning. What happened next would shake the entire police department to its core. The rain continued to fall, soaking Officer Grant to the bone as he stood by the side of the road. His chest tightened, his thoughts racing. The faces in the crowd still lingered, their phones capturing every humiliating second. He felt his career slipping through his fingers, but for now, he could only stand there, numb and paralyzed. Back in his car, he slammed the door shut, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His mind replayed the man's words, "You're not getting off that easy." What had that meant? Who was he? Grant had seen wealthy people before, but this man wasn't just rich, he had influence, power. It was in the way he carried himself, the way those two security personnel had arrived like they were waiting for something like this to happen. Grant turned off his flashing lights and pulled away from the curb, driving aimlessly through the city. The streets blurred in his vision, the rain smearing across his windshield. He thought about calling his captain to explain the situation, maybe spin the story in his favor. But what could he say? He'd stopped a man without cause, searched his car illegally, and created a scene. He couldn't justify any of it. Meanwhile, the man in the suit sat silently in the back seat of his sports car as his driver navigated through the rain. His calm demeanor had returned, but his jaw was clenched, and his mind was far from at ease. The events of the evening had left him simmering with frustration, though he wasn't entirely surprised. Encounters like this weren't new to him. He leaned back in his seat, staring out at the city lights streaking by. It wasn't just about him, it never was. He had spent years building his empire, climbing from nothing to the very top. The wealth, the influence, the respect he'd earned, it came with a price. There were always people like Officer Grant, quick to judge, quick to act, simply because they couldn't fathom that someone like him could hold so much power. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, breaking the silence. "Are you sure you don't want to go straight home, sir? It's been a long night." The man shook his head. "No. Take me to the office. I need to make some calls." The driver nodded, understanding without further explanation. The man didn't need to say it, he was already working through how to handle the situation. This wasn't just about filing a complaint or making the officer apologize. This was about sending a message, ensuring that what happened tonight wouldn't happen again to him, or to anyone else. As the car pulled up to a towering glass building downtown, the man stepped out, his security detail close behind. The lobby was quiet at this hour, the usual buzz of activity replaced by the soft hum of rain against the windows. He moved quickly, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor as he headed to the elevator. Upstairs, in his private office, the man sank into a leather chair, his fingers drumming against the desk. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts before dialing a number. The line rang twice before a deep, steady voice answered. "Good evening, sir," the voice said. "Evening," the man replied. "We need to talk." The conversation that followed was brief but intense. The man's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that left no room for misinterpretation. By the time he hung up, the wheels were already in motion. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. This wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was bigger than that. The man had spent years advocating for change, quietly funding initiatives and programs to address the systemic issues he'd seen growing up. But tonight had reminded him how far there was to go. He couldn't let this slide, not when it had happened to him, not when it could happen to others who didn't have the resources or influence to fight back. Back at the precinct, Officer Grant sat in the break room, staring blankly at the coffee in his hands. He couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his gut, the certainty that this incident wasn't over. He glanced around the room at his colleagues, some chatting, others working on reports. None of them knew what had happened yet, but it was only a matter of time. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and frowned at the screen. It was a call from his captain. His stomach twisted as he answered. "Grant," the captain's gruff voice came through the line. "My office." "Now." The line went dead before Grant could respond. He set his coffee down, his hand trembling slightly. He knew this wasn't going to be good. In the captain's office, the air was heavy. The captain sat behind his desk, his expression hard to read. On the desk was a tablet, the screen lit up with a paused video. Grant's heart sank when he recognized the scene. It was him, standing in the rain, yelling at the man in the suit. "Do you want to explain this?" the captain asked, gesturing to the screen. Grant opened his mouth, but no words came out. "It's all over social media," the captain continued. "Videos, photos, comments, it's already going viral." "Do you have any idea who that man is?" Grant shook his head, his throat dry. The captain leaned forward, his voice dropping. "He's not just some guy with a nice car, Grant. He paused, glancing at the tablet. "Let's just say he's a very powerful man. And he's already made some calls. The chief's been on the phone all night. The mayor's involved. And now I'm stuck cleaning up your mess. Grant's face burned with humiliation. You didn't what? The captain snapped. You didn't pull him over without cause? You didn't search his car? You didn't make a complete fool of yourself in front of half the city? Grant swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping. I thought he was suspicious, he mumbled. The captain sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Suspicious, he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. Do you have any idea how bad this looks? How bad this is for the department? You need to understand something, Grant. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about us, about the entire force. And right now, we're all under a microscope because of your stupidity. Grant looked down at his hands, shame washing over him. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, but he knew there was no point. The damage was done. The captain leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. Look, I don't know what's going to happen next. But if I were you, I'd start preparing for the worst. Grant nodded silently, his mind racing. He left the office feeling like the walls were closing in around him. Meanwhile, the man in the suit sat in his office, watching the storm unfold online. The videos of the encounter had spread quickly, sparking outrage and conversations across the city. Comments flooded in, some calling for justice, others sharing their own stories of similar experiences. He scrolled through the posts, his jaw tightening as he read the reactions. It wasn't just about him anymore, this had struck a nerve with people far and wide. And while part of him felt vindicated, another part felt the weight of responsibility. The phone on his desk buzzed, and he answered it without hesitation. We've received the response you were expecting, a voice said on the other end. The man nodded. Good. Let's keep the pressure on. This isn't just about accountability, it's about making sure this doesn't happen again. The voice on the other end paused before replying, Understood, sir. As the call ended, the man leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city's skyline. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like progress was within reach. Back at the precinct, Grant sat at his desk, his hands trembling as he stared at his computer screen. The story was everywhere now, and his name was quickly becoming synonymous with everything wrong in the department. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but he also knew he couldn't face what was coming. And as the night stretched on, he found himself consumed by a question he couldn't shake. How did it all go so wrong? Officer Grant's pulse pounded as he sat in his car, parked in the farthest corner of the station lot. Rain tapped against the windshield, the sound somehow amplifying the suffocating silence around him. The captain's words echoed in his mind, but it wasn't just the scolding that rattled him, it was the truth in them. He knew he had messed up. He'd acted on assumptions, fueled by something he didn't want to admit even to himself. His phone vibrated on the seat beside him, the bright screen cutting through the dim interior of the car. For a moment, he thought about ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of him. He picked it up to see a flood of notifications. Text messages from coworkers, old friends, even his family. Most of them didn't say much, just links to the videos and vague messages like, "Is this you?" or "What's going on?" Grant's stomach churned as he opened one of the videos. There he was, standing in the rain, his voice raised, his tone aggressive. The comment section was brutal. Words like power trip and abuse of authority scrolled past, mixed with harsher accusations. Grant couldn't look away, even though every second made his chest feel tighter. He tossed the phone back onto the seat, running a hand down his face. What was he supposed to do now? He couldn't undo what had happened. The captain's warning rang loud in his ears, start preparing for the worst. Across the city, the man in the suit was watching a different kind of storm unfold. His office had turned into a hub of activity. Phones rang nonstop, emails poured in, and his assistant was juggling updates from the media, lawyers, and advocacy groups. What had started as an isolated incident was now spiraling into something far bigger. The man sat at his desk, his calm exterior betraying none of the firestorm around him. But inside, his mind was racing. He hadn't expected the story to explode the way it had. People from all walks of life were sharing their outrage, their support, and most importantly, their own stories. The incident had become a flashpoint, drawing attention to an issue that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. He glanced at his assistant, who was relaying updates from another call. "The press conference is scheduled for tomorrow," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "Are you sure you want to go through with it?" "Things are already escalating." The man's gaze didn't waver. "This needs to be addressed. No more sweeping things under the rug. It's time." She nodded, scribbling notes before stepping out of the room. He leaned back in his chair, staring out at the rain streaking the floor-to-ceiling windows. There was no turning back now. At the station, things were growing tense. Officers whispered in corners, their eyes darting toward Grant whenever he passed by. The once friendly camaraderie of the precinct felt cold and distant now. He was no longer just one of them, he was a liability. Grant kept his head down, focusing on his reports, but the weight of the stares was unbearable. It didn't help that every few minutes, another ping from his phone reminded him that the outside world wasn't letting this go. By mid-afternoon, the captain called him back into the office. Grant felt the familiar knot in his stomach tighten as he walked down the hall, the whispers growing louder behind him. The captain didn't mince words this time. "Grant, you're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately." Grant's head snapped up. "What?" "No, you can't." The captain raised a hand to cut him off. "This isn't up for debate. The chief made the call, and honestly, you should have seen this coming. The public is demanding accountability, and right now, you're the face of this mess." Grant's mouth went dry. He wanted to argue, to plead his case, but deep down, he knew there was no point. The captain handed him a folder with the details of his leave and motioned toward the door. "Take this time to think about what you're going to say if this goes to an official review." "And Grant?" He paused in the doorway, not turning back. "Stay out of the spotlight. Don't make this worse than it already is." Grant left the station feeling hollow. He wasn't sure where to go or what to do. His world was unraveling faster than he could keep up, and there was no way to stop it. That evening, the city buzzed with anticipation. News outlets teased the upcoming press conference, promising exclusive coverage and insights into the man's next move. Social media was ablaze with speculation, people dissecting every angle of the story. Some were calling for the officer's resignation, while others debated the larger implications of the incident. The man in the suit sat in a quiet conference room, going over his notes one last time. His team had prepped him extensively, but he didn't need much coaching. He knew exactly what he wanted to say. This wasn't about revenge or personal vindication, it was about shining a light on an issue that had been ignored for too long. The next morning, the press conference room was packed. Cameras lined the back wall, reporters filled the seats, and a low hum of anticipation hung in the air. When the man finally stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He began to speak, his voice calm but firm. He recounted the events of that night, not as a victim, but as a witness to something larger than himself. He spoke about accountability, fairness, and the importance of addressing biases in all systems, not just law enforcement. But it was when he began sharing his personal experiences, the times he'd been underestimated, judged, and dismissed because of how he looked, that the room seemed to hold its breath. His words weren't just about the officer or the incident, they were about a system that needed to change. As he finished, the room erupted into questions, cameras flashing as reporters shouted over one another. He answered a few, his composure unwavering, before stepping away from the podium. The moment he left, the coverage exploded across every platform. Back at his apartment, Grant watched the press conference in stunned silence. The man's words cut deep, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Grant had never stopped to consider the impact of his actions, the assumptions he made without thinking. His phone buzzed again, but this time, he ignored it. For the first time in days, he felt the weight of what he'd done, not just to himself, but to someone else. The tension in the city was palpable. People were choosing sides, debating the fallout. Protests were organized, discussions erupted on talk shows, and everywhere Grant turned, there was no escape from what had happened. And yet, despite the chaos, one question loomed larger than the rest: what would happen next? The rain had finally stopped, but the city felt heavier than ever. Officer Grant sat in his dimly lit apartment, the press conference replaying in his mind like a broken record. He hadn't slept all night, the man's words digging deeper into his thoughts with each passing hour. It wasn't just guilt anymore, it was fear. Something about the way the man spoke had struck a nerve, as though he'd been holding back something much bigger. Grant couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. And he was right. It started with an unmarked envelope slipped under his door. At first, he thought it was another letter of protest. He'd been getting plenty of those, but when he opened it, his blood ran cold. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message typed in bold letters: "You've made the wrong enemy." Grant's heart raced as he turned the envelope over, searching for clues, but there was nothing: no return address, no name, no way of knowing who had sent it. He tried to dismiss it as a prank, but the pit in his stomach told him otherwise. This was personal. Across the city, the man in the suit was receiving a very different kind of message. Sitting in his office, he reviewed a stack of documents his legal team had unearthed. They were digging into Officer Grant's history, and what they found only deepened the mystery. There were whispers of past complaints, cases that had been quietly dismissed, and patterns of behavior that painted a troubling picture. But it wasn't just about the officer anymore. As they dug deeper, they uncovered something much larger: a network of people protecting each other, covering up mistakes, and silencing anyone who tried to speak out. The man leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just a fight for his own justice. It was a fight for everyone who'd been overlooked, dismissed, or wronged by the system. He knew exposing it would come with risks, but the truth was too important to stay hidden. As the news cycle continued, a second wave of outrage hit the city when a leaked recording surfaced. Someone had recorded a private conversation between two officers at the precinct. The voices were clear, their words cutting through the static like a blade. They talked about making this go away and shutting him up before things get worse. It was a damning piece of evidence, and it added fuel to the fire that was already burning out of control. Grant heard the recording while sitting in his car, parked in an empty lot. He didn't recognize the voices, but he knew what it meant. The department was panicking, and they were willing to do whatever it took to protect themselves, even if it meant throwing him under the bus. For the first time since this all started, Grant felt truly alone. He thought about calling someone, anyone, but who could he trust? The people he'd worked alongside for years were now treating him like a liability, and the public had already made up their minds about him. As night fell, Grant's paranoia grew. He double-checked the locks on his doors, peeked through the blinds every few minutes, and jumped at every little sound. The note in the envelope had been just the beginning. Someone wanted to send a message, and he had no idea what they were planning next. Meanwhile, the man in the suit was preparing for his next move. He sat at a round table with his team, maps and files spread out before them. The leaked recording had changed everything, giving them the leverage they needed to push forward. But with that leverage came danger. One of his advisors leaned in, her voice low. "If we keep going, there's no turning back. You know they're going to retaliate." He nodded, his expression unyielding. "Let them. If they think intimidation is going to stop this, they don't know who they're dealing with." As they planned their next steps, another layer of the conflict began to reveal itself. Unbeknownst to both the man and Officer Grant, a third party was watching from the shadows. This group had been monitoring the situation from the beginning, waiting for the right moment to intervene. They weren't aligned with the man in the suit or the police, they had their own agenda. And now, with the city on edge and tensions at an all-time high, they were ready to make their move. Grant's unease turned to full-blown panic when he noticed a car parked outside his apartment. It had been there for hours, its windows dark and its engine silent. He tried to convince himself it was just a coincidence, but when he stepped out to confront it, the car sped away, its tires screeching against the wet pavement. He called the precinct, hoping for some reassurance, but the response he got only made things worse. "Grant, you're on leave." "We can't send a unit for something like this," the dispatcher said, her tone dismissive. Grant hung up, his hands shaking. He was on his own now. Across town, the man in the suit received a cryptic message of his own. An anonymous email landed in his inbox, containing a single sentence: "Be careful who you trust." Attached was a grainy photo of him leaving his office earlier that day, taken from a distance. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. Who had sent the email? And what were they trying to warn him about? As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, both men realized they were caught in something far bigger than they had anticipated. The stakes were no longer just about justice or accountability, they were about survival. The city seemed to hold its breath as the tension reached a breaking point. Protests grew louder, investigations intensified, and whispers of corruption spread like wildfire. But behind the scenes, a dangerous game was unfolding, and neither the man nor Officer Grant could see the full picture. What they didn't know was that the third party had already started pulling strings. And by the time they realized what was happening, it would be too late to stop it. The city seemed eerily quiet the next morning, as if the tension from the last few days had finally forced everything to a standstill. Officer Grant woke up to find another note slipped under his door. This time, the message wasn't cryptic. It read, "Meet me at the old rail yard, 8 p.m. Come alone. You'll want answers." His first instinct was to ignore it. Whoever was behind these messages clearly had an agenda, and walking into their trap wasn't high on his list of smart decisions. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he didn't have much of a choice. His reputation was in ruins, his colleagues had abandoned him, and the shadows closing in around him were growing darker by the hour. If there was even a chance this meeting could give him clarity, or a way out, he had to take it. As night fell, he parked his car a block away from the rail yard and approached on foot, his nerves stretched thin. The place was as deserted as he'd expected, the cold air biting against his skin as he scanned the area. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. Grant froze, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't who he had expected. It was the man in the suit. "I figured you'd come," the man said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of authority. Grant's hands instinctively balled into fists. "What do you want from me?" The man studied him for a moment before speaking. "You've been so focused on covering yourself, Officer Grant, that you haven't stopped to consider what's really going on." Grant narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" The man stepped closer, pulling a small folder from under his arm and handing it over. Grant hesitated before taking it, flipping it open to reveal pages of documents, photos, and transcripts. His stomach churned as he read through them. It wasn't just about him. The files detailed a web of corruption within the precinct, stretching far beyond what he'd imagined. Officers, administrators, even local officials were implicated. Grant had always suspected things weren't perfect, but this was far worse than he could have imagined. "This isn't just about you and me," the man continued. "This is about a system that protects itself at the expense of everyone else. And you've been their pawn." Grant shook his head, the weight of the revelations crashing down on him. "Why are you showing me this? What do you expect me to do?" The man's expression hardened. "You need to decide which side you're on. You can keep running, keep hiding, or you can help expose the truth." But let me be clear, this isn't just about saving yourself anymore. If you want to make things right, you'll have to face the people you've been protecting. Grant's mind raced. He wanted to argue, to push back, but deep down, he knew the man was right. Before he could respond, the sound of tires screeching broke the silence. Both men turned as several unmarked vehicles pulled into the rail yard, their headlights flooding the scene. A group of figures stepped out, armed and moving with purpose. Grant's blood turned cold as he recognized one of them, his precinct captain. "Well, isn't this a cozy little meeting?" the captain said, his voice dripping with mockery. He motioned toward Grant and the man in the suit. "You two have been causing a lot of trouble. It's time we put an end to it." Grant stepped back, his pulse hammering in his ears. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, though he already knew the answer. The captain smirked. "Cleaning up a mess." "You should have kept your mouth shut, Grant. Now you're just another loose end." The man in the suit didn't flinch. "You're digging yourself deeper, Captain. There are already eyes on you. Whatever you do here tonight won't go unnoticed." The captain's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "Maybe. But dead men don't talk." The tension was suffocating as the armed figures closed in. Grant's mind raced, his survival instincts kicking in. He wasn't a hero, he didn't know how to navigate a situation like this. But something about the man in the suit's unwavering composure gave him pause. Before anyone could make a move, the sound of distant sirens pierced the air. The captain cursed under his breath, motioning for his men to retreat. "This isn't over," he growled, glaring at Grant and the man before disappearing into the night. As the vehicles sped away, Grant turned to the man, his chest heaving. "You called for backup?" The man shook his head. "No. But I knew they'd come." Grant stared at him, trying to make sense of everything. "Who are you, really? Why are you doing all this?" The man hesitated, his calm exterior flickering for the first time. "Because I've seen what happens when people like him get away with it. And because someone needs to hold them accountable." It wasn't the answer Grant had expected, but it was enough to convince him. For the first time, he felt a sliver of hope, like maybe, just maybe, he could help set things right. The sirens grew louder as police cruisers arrived, their lights flashing against the night sky. Officers poured out, but these weren't from Grant's precinct. They were from an external task force, brought in to investigate the growing allegations. Grant handed over the folder, knowing it was only the beginning. The battle ahead would be long and difficult, but he was finally ready to face it. As he watched the task force officers collect evidence and secure the scene, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The man in the suit had disappeared, blending into the chaos without a trace. And then it hit him, the final twist he hadn't seen coming. One of the officers handed him a report, freshly printed and marked as urgent. He skimmed the pages, his hands trembling as the truth came to light. The man in the suit wasn't just a victim of the system, he was once part of it. Before his rise to prominence, the man had been a prosecutor, working cases that tied directly to the corruption they were now exposing. But somewhere along the way, he'd turned against his own, using his knowledge and connections to bring the system crashing down from the inside. Grant stared at the report, his mind reeling. The man's calm confidence, his intricate knowledge of the players involved, it all made sense now. But it also raised new questions. Was he really a hero, or was this part of a larger plan? As the night wore on, Grant couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. The system was cracking, but it wasn't broken yet. And the man in the suit, whoever he truly was, had just become the most powerful and dangerous player in the game. The next morning, Grant stood in the precinct parking lot, watching as the task force investigators moved in and out of the building. The sight of them collecting evidence, sorting through files, and questioning officers filled him with a mix of unease and relief. For years, this place had been his second home, a symbol of law and order. Now, it felt like a crime scene, a hollow shell of everything it was supposed to stand for. He leaned against his car, the weight of the last few days pressing down on him. He knew the fallout from last night wasn't over. The man in the suit, whoever he really was, had set a chain reaction in motion, one that was tearing apart the rotten foundation of the system. But for Grant, the consequences were personal. He had to face his own mistakes, his own part in allowing things to fester. The questions he had been avoiding for so long couldn't be ignored anymore. One of the task force agents approached him, holding a folder thick with papers. Grant recognized the woman from the night before. Her sharp, no-nonsense demeanor stood out in the chaos. She stopped a few feet away, giving him a look that was hard to read. "We've been digging through the files," she said. "Your name comes up in a lot of places, Officer Grant." He tensed, unsure of where this was going. And she continued, flipping open the folder, "it's clear you were following orders. Orders from people who knew exactly what they were doing. But that doesn't absolve you. You're not innocent in this, Grant." Her words stung, but he nodded. "I know. What I want to know," she said, her tones softening just slightly, "is whether you're ready to help us. You were in the middle of this. You saw things. Heard things. If you're willing to cooperate, it could make all the difference." Grant thought about it for a long moment. He had spent years convincing himself that he was just doing his job, that he wasn't responsible for the corruption happening around him. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He had looked the other way when it was convenient, stayed silent when speaking up might have made a difference. And now, he had a chance to do something about it. "I'll help," he said finally. "Whatever you need." The agent nodded, a hint of approval in her eyes. "Good. But be prepared, it's going to get messy. People are going to come after you, try to discredit you, maybe worse." Grant swallowed hard. He knew she was right. His former colleagues wouldn't take this lying down, especially the ones who had the most to lose. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing the right thing. As the agent walked away, Grant's thoughts drifted to the man in the suit. Despite everything, he still didn't know the full truth about him. Why had he chosen Grant? Why had he risked everything to expose the corruption? And most importantly, where was he now? Later that afternoon, Grant received a call. The voice on the other end was calm, familiar. "Meet me at the coffee shop on Main. 1 hour. It was him. Grant arrived at the small, quiet CAF, scanning the room until he spotted the man sitting at a corner table. He looked as composed as ever, a cup of coffee in front of him and a stack of papers at his side. Grant sat down across from him, unsure of what to say. "You've had quite a week," the man said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "That's one way to put it," Grant replied. "You disappeared last night." "Why?" The man shrugged. "My work there was done. Besides, I prefer to stay out of the spotlight." Grant leaned forward, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Who are you, really?" "I've seen the files. I know you used to be part of the system. So why are you doing this?" The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet determination. "Because I've seen what happens when people like your captain are allowed to thrive. I was part of it once, yes. I made my share of mistakes. But I got out, and I've spent every day since trying to make up for it." Grant studied him, trying to gauge whether he was telling the truth. "So what now? You just disappear again, move on to the next precinct, the next problem?" The man shook his head. "No. This is bigger than one precinct. The corruption runs deep, deeper than you realize. But last night was a start. A crack in the armor. Now it's up to people like you to keep it going." Grant frowned. "And you? Where do you fit into all of this?" The man took a sip of his coffee, his expression unreadable. "Let's just say I'll be watching. And if you ever need help, you'll know where to find me." Before Grant could respond, the man stood up, gathering his papers. "Take care of yourself, Officer Grant. And Reem. Burr, this isn't just about cleaning up the mess. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again." With that, he walked out, leaving Grant alone with his thoughts. Over the next few weeks, the investigation gained momentum. More arrests were made, more files uncovered. The captain and several high-ranking officers were charged with a laundry list of crimes, their decades-long reign of corruption finally coming to an end. Grant testified multiple times, each appearance a reminder of the choices that had brought him to this point. It wasn't easy. He faced backlash from former colleagues, whispers behind his back, and more than a few sleepless nights. But as the days turned into weeks, he began to feel a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer just a cog in the machine, he was part of something bigger, something that mattered. One evening, as he walked out of the precinct, his phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number, but the message was clear: "Good work. Keep going." Grant smiled faintly, tucking the phone back into his pocket. He didn't know where the man in the suit was or what he was planning next, but he felt a strange sense of gratitude. The man had forced him to confront his own flaws, his own role in the system's failures. And in doing so, he had given him a chance to start over. As he drove home, the city lights stretched out before him, glittering against the dark sky. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But it was a fight worth having, and he was ready to see it through. In the end, it wasn't about the man in the suit or the files or even the arrests. It was about the people who had been hurt, the lives that had been broken by the corruption. And it was about making sure that, going forward, things would be different. Grant didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't look the other way again. Not now. Not ever.